Welcome, class. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about employee selection. So let's get started. The process in general for receiving people who are interested in applying for a job within a company is pretty straightforward. Step number one is you receive the applications. Two, you interview the applications. Three, you may give the applicant some type of a test or that you want them to perform. Four, conduct background investigations. Five, arrange for any physical examinations if that's necessary. Six, placing and assigning new employees. You want to put them where they belong. Seven, coordinate for follow-up with the new employees. Eight, do exit interviews for those when someone decides to leave the company. And then nine, you want to keep all the records that were associated with that employee while he or she was working for the company. The focus of this lecture is really on number 6, placing and assigning new employees into the employment positions that they're seeking out or that you've identified as a company that fit that employee very well. This flow chart really models out the selection process of an employee. So the applicant has interest in a job. You know they're interested because they apply for the job. They submit their resume. By the way, you should note that when a person submits a resume for a specific job, that resume, according to EEO regulations, is to be considered the same as a person who's applying. Therefore, it's automatically protected by EEO guidelines and the laws associated with equal employment opportunity. So you then do any kind of pre-employment screening. So here, you're screening. It sounds kind of harsh when I say it this way, but you're weeding out the people that you don't want. You're really starting your process of being selective, okay? You have the application form. So here it is now. We got the applicants that we're interested in, and you may then give them some kind of test. You give them interviews. You can see that's taking place at this stage right here. Those that make it past that, you'll engage in then background investigation. So from here, you probably whittled it down to maybe 10 or fewer qualified people for the job that you're really interested in. You don't want to do background investigations on 50 people because that's time consuming and also very expensive. So you only want to do background searches on individuals who have made it to a certain place in the job. You're really trying to determine, are they a good fit for the company? Is there any major red flags that would cause you to, once again, eliminate or screen a person out? So selection process is all about eliminating people that are not the right folks. You want to do initial interview. Oftentimes this is very popular, right? So your first set of interviews may be with the HR manager and maybe one with the hiring manager. Your second set of interviews may be with the rest of the team or vice president or director. If a person passes all those stages and you're interested in them working for your company, you then make a job offer. That job offer is oftentimes contingent. It's contingent upon some future tests, right? Drug tests, any kind of medical exam that may be necessary depending on the job, because we also have to adhere to ADA guidelines, and we can't screen people based on some form of disability. So you want to make sure your tests are not designed to identify disabilities, and you use that in your decision process, but they're really designed for work-related, work-appropriate activities. And then, your drug test, which is pretty standard. Then you put them in the job placement. Right? So job placement means you're actually going to get placed in the right job within the company. Bear in mind here that sometimes recruiters recruit people in mass, and then they go through a selection process, which is identifying the right person, and then a placement process where you're putting that person in a particular position. More commonly, what you're probably familiar with as a class would be you're applying for a job and you're applying for a specific role. In that case, placement is already taken off the table, because if you get selected for that job, you're automatically going to get placed in the job that you're applying for. Now let's talk about legally, what is an applicant? And this is the definition as outlined by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Anyone who has expressed interest through the internet, electronically, face-to-face, and is being considered for a specific position by the employer. Now note here, it's a specific position. So they're saying, I want that job right there. And they submitted documentation or formal level of interest in that job. They've identified that he or she has the basic qualifications. They do not remove their interest in the position at any time during the selection process, and they've been ranked using hit features, they have been ranked as using hit features by an employer software or other data techniques that are not linked to assessment. So this is what the EEOC requires or defines as an applicant. The selection process is the process of choosing individuals with the qualifications needed to fill certain jobs in an organization. Placement refers to putting that person in the right job. So you want to make sure you understand the difference. Placement and selection are two very different things. We've talked about this in previous lectures, the whole idea of person-job fit. And person-job fit at its core, it means taking the applicant's KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and matching them with the job's TDRs, tasks, duties, and responsibilities. When those two things line up, it means that you have a person who has all the abilities necessary to do the job and to do it well. When that happens, you should have job success. You also have a host of other positive things that take place: lower turnover, greater job satisfaction, greater productivity. A lot of positive things happen when you have the right KSAs and TDRs mixed together. So to that extent, HR professionals and hiring managers must place significant emphasis on making sure the people that they hire have the skills necessary to do the job. There is one school of thought out there that some people like to say, which is, I'll get somebody and I'm really looking for the right attitude and I'll train them on what I need to have them do. Well, research shows that you have better performance and better success when you hire people who already have the skills necessary to do the job well, rather than hiring somebody who you think is a great fit and then trying to teach them what needs to be done. So matching a person's knowledge, skills, and abilities with the characteristics of the job is at the core of person-job fit. And as I said before, you have higher performance, lower turnover. Person-job fit mismatches. So here's some places where people typically have not such a good fit with companies. So if you're looking for a job, you want to consider these things. As younger people tend to de-emphasize the importance of some of this stuff, whereas older people who are more seasoned and more experienced in their careers, they tend to take these factors very seriously. So one is geography and location. Is a job located someplace where the applicant is willing to live? For example, a lot of companies who are based up in Seattle and Massachusetts and Connecticut, they may have difficulty recruiting minorities. There's some places, some very small towns in like Michigan, where they have difficulty recruiting minorities just because there's no diversity in those cities. And when a minority candidate is going to apply to take a job there, they may be very interested in the job, but they're also thinking about their social life, their friends, their families, their ability to date and find a romantic partner. And when the city has no diversity, if they're looking for a diverse partner, then that's going to play a role on whether the person chooses the job or not. All right. Earnings expectations, another area where you have mixed matches, where sometimes the applicant has one set of expectations in terms of pay, they receive a job offer, and the pay is significantly different, usually to the negative. That's when there's a problem. I've talked to a number of college students graduating from the university, and their expectations is to get paid $70,000, $80,000 a year starting from undergraduate. Well, that's a very high salary bump, you know. So that's a very high salary to get paid coming straight out of undergrad. So they run the risk of having a mismatch in expectations, because if they do get a job offer, that job offer is $40,000 or $50,000, that person may feel somewhat slighted or undervalued and pass on the job offer because there's a mismatch of expectations. Work and family balance, work and family life. This is another area where companies are striving hard to improve. So you may have a job where you're working 60, 70 hours a week and you just don't have the time to be there for your family like you want to. That's a problem. So you may get a job expecting that you have a great family-oriented company that you're working for, only to find out that they're not. So this is another area quite possibly where there could be wrong expectations. Now, I can tell you a lot of corporations are moving to work at home setups or flexible schedules to allow for people to support their families while also supporting their work. So that's a great thing. Time and amount of work. This is another area where there could be a misunderstanding as well. How much time you're putting in, how much work is actually required of you. And then job skills and qualifications, another big area. You think that you have the skills, or oftentimes an applicant may position themselves as though they have a certain set of skills, where those skills may be actually very weak, but that's what the company needs. So now the person is in the job and they're unable to perform to a satisfactory level because their skill set is not as strong as they proclaimed. So these are just common areas where people have misunderstandings in terms of job placements and selection. This slide is really important as well. There are definitely questions that will come up in the database about this. So let's pretend, for example, we're a job recruiter and we are recruiting and interviewing people for a job. How do I know that that person is the right person for the job? Well, the first thing is that you need to have a set of criteria that you're looking for. So a criteria is a characteristic that a person must have in order to successfully perform the work. So maybe that's a certain skill, maybe that's a certain level of communication, a certain level of leadership, but I have all these criterion. But now that I have the criteria identified for a person to be successful in this job, I have to find a way to measure it. I got to find a way to say, all right, when it comes to communication, this person is 8 out of 10. When it comes to leadership, this person is 7 out of 10. When it comes to mathematical abilities, this person scored 970 on a test, right? So you got to be able to measure accurately and objectively the person or the applicant's performance against that criteria. And we call that your, predictors, right? So if I measure your mathematical ability and you get 975 out of 1,000, then that tells me that your math skills are pretty strong. So I could use that to predict your level of performance. So it's a predictor. So that criterion, now that I've measured data, that data that I have in that category is a predictor. Okay? It's a predictor of how well you'll do your job. Now, predictors are only as good as they are reliable and valid. And this is important that you note the difference between the two. Validity means that there's a correlation between that and job performance. So if your job is an engineer, then I could say the higher you score in the math test, the better engineer you're most likely going to be, because this job requires a lot of math. So there's a strong correlation between your score in this test and performance as an engineer. The strongest correlation that a person can get is 1. Okay, now that could be either positive 1 or negative 1, but 1 represents 100. So if it's positive 1, that means it's a perfect correlation. So this always correlates with that. Math always correlates with engineering. It's 100% satisfaction. If it is negative 1, then it's a complete negative correlation, right? So you would say, for example, ice cream and temperature. The hotter it is, the faster the ice cream melts. So it's 100% correlation. It's just negative 1. Okay? So you could have correlations either be positive or correlations be negative. But if the closer they are to 1, either positive or negative, the stronger the correlation is, and the better it can be used as a predictor. That's what's most important. Don't get caught up on whether the correlation is positive or negative. You want to be able to predict. So I could say, man, I want a lot of ice cream. Oh, I just want so much ice cream. It's very important to me to have a lot of ice cream. So I have this 10-gallon bucket of ice cream. I'm so happy. But I can tell you one thing, the hotter it is outside, the faster that ice cream is going to melt. So in that sense, it's a negative correlation between temperature and the amount of ice cream I'm able to keep. Does that make sense? The colder it is, the more ice cream I get to keep. The hotter it is, the less ice cream I get to keep. The question here is, can temperature be used to predict the amount of ice cream I get to keep? And the answer is yes. So whether it's a positive correlation or a negative correlation, the closer it is to 1, positive or negative, think of it as the absolute value of 1 if you want to, the better the predictor. The closer it is to 0, the worse the predictor. So let's say I got, once again, a 10-gallon bucket of ice cream, and I want to predict how much ice cream I get to keep. All right. And I look at my internet speed. Say, well, my internet speed is 50 megs. That's pretty decent for a household. So how well does having how much internet speed a person has in their house predict how much ice cream they get to keep? And the answer is none. There's no correlation. There's some houses that have 100 or 300 megs of download speed. There's some houses that have no internet at all. And it has nothing to do. I cannot look at internet speed and predict the amount of ice cream. So that would be considered a zero correlation. So the closer a correlation is to zero, the worse predictor it can be. Now let's take this back to interviewing and pay very close attention to this slide because there are lots of questions that you'll have in the database about this. If I select something to interview someone, I pick a criteria to interview someone at. Let's say I'm going to pick height, and I'm going to use their height to decide whether they're going to be a good engineer or not. Is height a good correlation for engineering success as an engineer? The answer would be no. The correlation would be very weak. It may be like a 0.3% correlation or something like that. So whereas you want to have something as close to 1. If it was like 0.8, then that would be high. That would be great. 0.9, that would be high. But in general, men are probably more male engineers than women. In general, men tend to be taller than women. Therefore, there would be some correlation. It'd just be a very weak correlation. So maybe like 30% or 0.3. So would I want to use that criterion to predict success as an engineer? The answer would be no, because it's a weak correlation. The closer the correlation is to zero, the worse it is as a predictor. So that's validity. Validity is nothing but your correlation score that ranges between -1 and +1. And the closer it is to 1, or the absolute value of 1, the stronger the prediction is. The closer it is to 0, the weaker the prediction is. And when a correlation is actually 0, that means there's absolutely no correlation between those items. So I could say something about the amount of hairs on a person's head and them being a good engineer. So we take the time to count how many hairs a person has on their head, and we find that there's no correlation at all. There's no relationship between how much hair a person has and their quality of being an engineer. So we would not want to use that as a predictor. We would not want to use it as a criterion to evaluate people to hire, the people we're going to hire. The next we want to talk about is reliability. Reliability refers to this. How consistently strong is the correlation across different audiences? So if I take that same criterion, let's say leadership or communication or math skills or whatever it is we want to say, English skills, or the score a person has on the GMAT, the score a person has on the ACT. Take any criterion that you want, and I want to say, does that criteria, does its validity hold, its ability to predict, does that hold up across different situations? So if I did that same test to somebody who was 40 or somebody who was 25, did the predictions ability hold up? Was that test reliable? If I did it across men versus women, was it still able to accurately predict success that a person would have on a job? If I did it in the morning time versus at nighttime, if I did it for short people or tall people or big people or small people, I varied the situation up dramatically. How reliable is that predictor? Does it always give me a strong correlation, a strong predictive value of what it is I'm trying to identify? So here I am now as a recruiter, and I want to really identify the right person for a job. The items that I want to evaluate a person off of, I want them to be something that helps translate to success in the job. So I have to identify those things. Okay, these 4 things I believe will lead to success in the job. The next thing I need to ask myself is, what's the validity of those? How accurately are they predicting success? And then if I measure across different people or different audiences, different times, different zip codes, different locations in the country, how reliably predictable are those? The last thing on this slide we want to discuss is a correlation coefficient. And believe it or not, we've been discussing it all along. When I talk about the predictive power of a criterion, that's really the coefficient. When I gave you the numbers of -1 to +1, that really is your correlation coefficient. So that's a number that gives you the relationship, the strength of how valid, how predictable your criterion is. And the key there is, the closer it is to either 1 or -1, the better it is. The closer it is to 0, the worse the predictor is. If you don't understand this, take time to listen to this portion of the lecture again and Google it, or shoot me an email and I could be happy to provide you additional insights on this particular slide. Now, there are two different approaches that recruiters can use when looking at predictors and how to use them in the interviewing in the selection process. One is called multiple hurdles. Multiple hurdles basically establishes a minimum cutoff level of performance that a person must have across any of the predictors. So I could say that everybody's going to take a math test, everybody's going to take a vocabulary test, and you must score at least 500 on math and at least 700 on verbal in order to qualify for the job. If you score less on any of those, either math or verbal, then you're not going to be qualified for this job, right? So it's a minimum cutoff. And this is helpful when it comes to weeding out individuals. So very useful technique in the selection process. Compensatory approach is a little bit different. What that says is we are going to take your performances and add them up. So let's say, for example, you got 500 on verbal. However, you got 900 on math. It's like, wow, on math, you're really strong, but verbal, could use some significant improvement. Technically, if I'm using multiple hurdles, you would not get the job offer because your score on verbal is too low. Your score on math was great, but your score on verbal is too low. And if you don't make the minimum cutoff across each criteria, you're not going to move forward. The compensatory approach is different in that it says, well, your performance on math is great, so we're going to use that to compensate for your verbal performance. And what this means is that you may be able to move forward in the interviewing process, even though your verbal skills did not meet what they really wanted it to meet at, because your performance on one can compensate. This approach is oftentimes used with graduate schools. So they'll say, well, we really want you to have a GPA of 3.5 or 3.2 undergrad GPA. Here's a person applying, they have a 3.1 GPA. However, they took the GMAT test and they scored very, very high on the GMAT test. So they scored 750, 780 on the GMAT test, which is a great score. So then the people who are making the decisions on whether they'll admit you into graduate school or not would say, yeah, the GPA was low. However, did you see their GMAT score? And the GMAT score would compensate for that of the low GPA. So that's what we call the compensatory approach. And recruiters can use the same process to evaluate applicants in the hiring process. This slide gives you some of the responsibilities of the HR unit versus the hiring manager. So the HR unit, when it comes to selection, they greet the interviews, they greet the applicants that are applying, they conduct the screening interview, they administer any type of employment test that needs to be done, they'll run the background checks on the applicants, they refer the candidates to the managers for final selection, and this is important to note, the hiring manager always, always, always makes the final decision on who's going to be hired or not. And it is not the HR department. So, and the HR department also evaluates the process to see, did we do a good job in this process of selection? The hiring managers, in contrast, they're the ones that put in the requisition request to HR to say, we need to hire someone. They get all the appropriate approvals from the people who are higher up in the organization. They participate in the selection process as needed, but they do the final interviews. When I say this, they may come in and interview the director or vice president as well. Most commonly, the vice president or the director, if they're interviewing you as a candidate, they're really just trying to assess whether you're a good fit for the company. And oftentimes they kick that decision right back down to the hiring manager to make that final decision. They make the final selection and also provide any kind of follow-up information as necessary. Applications. This is a formal record of a person's desire to have a particular job. So it provides a profile on the applicant. It provides documentation that can be stored by the company on this applicant. And it's a very important part of the selection process. Without people coming in and putting in applications, basically the selection process would never start. As far as the EEO is concerned, resumes that are submitted for a particular job are considered applications. And they should be checked for truthfulness, but the EEO guidelines protect them all the same. It's important for applicants to know this information, so companies should provide this to them, that whether the employment is at will or not, or is contract-based employment, references, any tests that need to be performed to make sure the person fits the criteria, how long the application process would be, right? And also what would happen if there's any false information. Generally, falsified information would result in termination of a job. There's somebody at Dell who applied for a job and they actually stated some false information about their college degree, indicated they got a degree from a certain university when they didn't. That person has been at Dell for years. I want to say maybe 10, 15 years, have made it up into some fairly high positions in the company. And when they did an audit, I assume the person must have been applying for a new job. And HR went back and did an audit, and they found that the person had lied on their application all those years ago, and they were immediately terminated. So be careful about stretching the truth too much on your resumes or on job applications. Okay? In order to help deal with selection, especially if you're doing internet-based recruiting, you get a lot of people in, you need to kind of weed people out. You can use electronic screening to help you with that. It's very useful when you have large amounts of people who are applying for a job, where you need to increase the quality of people that are ultimately making it past into the interviewing process. You need to speed up time, okay, because all this is computer operated. It can go a lot quicker than if you had individual people looking at and reviewing each resume or each applicant. It can help reduce the cost, once again, because you're using computer technology as opposed to people. It's cheaper. And it can help you to be able to recruit and screen people from all across the world. Actually, we would say just in the United States, but no, it's actually the entire world, because the computer software doesn't really matter where the application is coming from. A realistic job preview, we did talk about this in our last lecture, but it's the process of going through the entire job that a person would work while they're an applicant or while they're still applying for the job. So this may be something like a day or two long, and you want to basically understand that person's capabilities, so you can give them some tests. You can have them perform certain tasks that they would do if they were hired for the job. And it also gives the applicant a realistic idea of what it would be like working in that job for the company. It really can help avoid lawsuits. When hiring a person, you need to verify something, and this is American rules, right, the United States, but you need to verify two different things. You need to verify their identity, that the person is in fact who they say they are. The second thing you need to identify is their authority to work in the United States. Do they have permission to actually work and earn income in the United States? Now, what we do to verify identity is we take a person's driver's license or a state-issued photo ID. That's what companies rely on, because the state goes through all the efforts to verify that if John Doe is on this driver's license, this person is in fact John Doe. Therefore, companies can simply look at any state-issued ID, or most commonly a driver's license, and that's to verify your identity. The second thing they need to figure out is, do you have permission to work in the United States? Because maybe you have a driver's license, but you're not a U.S. citizen. You don't have authorization to work. So the next thing they look at is, do you have a Social Security card? All U.S. citizens have Social Security cards. So if you have a Social Security card, you are a U.S. citizen and you are authorized to work in the United States by the merit of being a U.S. citizen. Or do you have a birth certificate that's in the a U.S.-based birth certificate? These are two things that can be used to verify your authorization to work in the United States. So commonly when you start a new job, they're going to ask you to bring something from this category here and something from this category here. There are some documents alternatively that can satisfy both identity and authorization simultaneously. And that's what we have listed down here in these green boxes. So you can have a certificate of citizenship and naturalization. That would take care of both identity and employment authorization. You could have a U.S. passport. That would take care of both identity and authorization. You could have an alien card, or what's called a green card. That would take care of both identification and authorization. And you could have a foreign passport with a work authorization. And that would once again take care of both identity and authorization. Take time to study this. There are questions that you'll need to answer about this here in the coming quizzes and databases, quizzes and exams. Now, this is interesting. So you're going through the process of hiring people. Is it possible that you can make a mistake, hire somebody, and then something bad happens? And then the question there is, what level of responsibility does the company have for hiring that person? Well, here's the answer. They got two different situations. One is negligent hiring and the other is negligent retention. Negligent hiring occurs when an employer fails to do a proper background check and something bad happens because that person is working for them. So let's say, for example, we're the school district and we're hiring bus drivers. And I fail to do a sufficient background check and drug test on the individuals. So someone who has a drug issue, maybe they have a former arrest record for drug abuse or whatever, alcoholism or something like that, drunk driving, and I don't do proper due diligence and I hire them as a bus driver. Next thing you know, they're in a car accident because of that condition and people have gotten hurt. Is the school district responsible? Obviously, absolutely yes. What formal legal terms is it? It will be negligent hiring. The company should have taken steps to identify this person as a potential threat and never hired them in the first place. So yes, employers can be held liable for their employees' actions. Should someone become hurt? Should there be some type of financial loss if they hired someone that they shouldn't have hired? And there was plenty of opportunity and evidence for the company to know that. The company just failed to do its due diligence. The second thing is called negligent retention. Negligent retention refers to a company being aware that this employee has a problem and they fail to take steps to eliminate that employee, to correct the problem or deal with it. So they retain this employee even after they're aware that this employee has a problem. So let's go back to the bus driver example. Let's just say the company's hired, you've hired, your best friend. They work for, you're the supervisor, and you've hired your best friend, and you come in one day for work and you notice that your best friend is feeling kind of groggy, and you come to find out he's drunk and he's going to go. And so you sit him down. No, don't ride the bus today. Call in sick. You send him home. Well, he comes into work again. This time, maybe you're gone. You're not there, and he's drunk again. But you don't notice it. No one notices it. So then he gets in the bus, drives the bus, has a car accident. People get hurt. Well, this would be an example of negligent retention, because as a manager, you represent the company and you were aware that there were certain issues and problems with this particular employee, yet you failed to take any steps to deal with it. So you maintain, or the company maintained, that person's employment. And when something bad happened, when there's a financial cost, a loss of life, someone got hurt, guess what? The company is held liable. So when a company is aware that there may be a problem and the company fails to take proper steps to deal with it, that could be considered negligent retention. Now, the Fair Credit Reporting Act. When it comes to interviewing for a job, some companies will want to pull your credit report. Most companies don't, but some companies will need to. It's going to depend on the institution, and there are laws that protect you regarding this. So one, if a company is going to pull your credit report, they have to disclose, they have to tell you that they're going to pull a credit report. Right? Two, it requires written consent. So you actually have to give them written consent to do so, and it requires that they give you a copy of the report. These are all components of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There is a document that's going to be attached in the articles section of this module, which gives you additional information about the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You want to take time to read that. Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, we talked about this in Chapter 3 or Module 3. And it prohibits discrimination against any person with any type of disability. Why is this important? Why are we talking about this in the selection process? Well, because some employment tests that you give could borderline be tests that can be used to identify a person's disability. For example, let's say you're going to give a personality test as part of your application process. You're just trying to identify people with the right personality to be successful in this job. Well, that personality test could actually isolate people who have certain types of disabilities. Maybe they have some type of psychological disorder. That test reveals it and categorizes them systemically in a certain place so they never get jobs. Well, that would be a violation of ADA. So you have to be very careful with the types of tests that you're giving, medical exams, personality tests, psychological tests, to make sure you're not violating the ADA guidelines. Drug testing, very common and very appropriate to do, is the use of drug testing to identify people who are not using illegal drugs. If they are using illegal drugs, you do not have the right, you do not have to hire them, okay? And if you do hire them, you could be running the issue of negligent hiring, right? And when making a job offer, here are some guidelines. It's important that, one, when you're making an offer, that you do it in a formal process. By all means, you may get a telephone call from the company, or as a recruiter, you may call someone and say, I'm going to offer this job, and kind of walk through some of the details. But it's important that you follow up with something written. So formalize your offer with a letter to the applicant stating the exact terms and conditions of employment. All right? And a lot of times that offer is going to be contingent upon successful passing of a drug test. So, but you'll mention the salary, any kind of benefits, and those types of things. Avoid vague language, general statements, and making promises, and require that the person who's accepting the job offer sign it and return the offer letter to you. That way you know you have a formal acceptance. That wraps it up for this lecture. If you have any questions, please give me a call or shoot me an email. Thank you, and you have a great day.